In Heidegger's book Basic Concepts, he refers to being with the metaphor of painters of the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. I think that is a way of thinking of being that one could try thinking along with phenomenologically letting beings be in the sense described. Heidegger tells us that nothing is ever too simple or too basic in or too worn out to repeat in philosophy, because we have to think everything through afresh each time we set out. Yes, how would we think the foreground, the middle ground, and the background in terms of letting be, letting ourselves be the beings in our perfect focus, coming to the genius of whatever being that we're letting be, in then the motion which rolls back as though that were for us the low tide, but for the being the high tide, and then coming to our high tide, which would be the pridefulness of Hobbes, who understands our possibility as having things available to us as power, that human beings can ask themselves, what can I do with this, and come up with all kinds of answers and bring them into practice. So for the aspirants to Dasein, there was a bit of a felicitous accident or unexpected blessing in a piece of evidence that I discovered in listening to a college student who was assigned some Heidegger, reciting some Heidegger, and coming to the lines where Heidegger says, one usually says that one does not see the purpose, but this is a prejudice. He's speaking of some chalk, and then the student says, well, okay, Heidegger, but you should have chosen another example, because I know the purpose of chalk perfectly well. That doesn't, and they wouldn't accept it, but they thereby proved that, of course, anybody who's knows philosophy a little bit better would realize that when one says that we don't see the purposes, what he means is the eyes understood as the senses are not meant to see purposes any more than with all these examples about how can an animal see the danger in just from the visual. They must have something more than that, and then the problem arises. But it strikes one more directly, and I think that was a proof of it. What the student said was that for her, it was obvious. So you look at chalk, and chalk is for writing, chalk is an implement of the classroom, and so on. And this is true for everyone when we're not wrapped in some kind of already made instruction. So this is a big part of being, rather than and its being is being would then only, you could save that structure only so long as you're thinking of the phenomenology of it. The high tide of the letting be would be something that is the middle ground, and then again to the foreground, which would be this kind of Hobbesian having everything present to us, which then perhaps is more in a pure form in Descartes if one says Descartes doesn't have an interpretation. So if we know things on sight, then what is this? One thing we need a more precise understanding of what hermeneutic phenomenology means rather than Husserlian phenomenology. You see, if we're saying that just to look at something, the interpretation is already there. We know the purpose of something. Is that then an interpretation to say that chalk is for writing and so on? Or is it that that's a reading of the beings when they're let be? In other words, if you theorize it, then you think of the thrownness of ounce to growing into a language or a culture. That language or the culture already has this meaning of chalk within it, and you grow into it. And so that's straightforwardly the basic ground of your being already um, in the letting be. And it doesn't require, Heidegger's trying to get rid of both the idea, not just of senses, but of consciousness in Husserl's sense, to go to the letting be, where the letting be is the being showing itself from itself rather than consciousness grasping it, or rather than the senses grasping it. So the question of, is hermeneutics just interpretation? How so far can one be wrong then in letting be and grasping what it is? Is it a matter of getting a medium opinion somehow or something from the ordinary one's fellow Dasein? I would say there's a great question comes in about the difference between merely letting be and interpreting, which isn't um, so obvious if we don't, so obvious because so long as we make a distinction between the thing and then what we're saying about it, it seems so obvious that we can go wrong and have all kinds of artificial things said about phenomena. Um, so it's difficult to weigh all that. I want to try to distinguish that from things like um, I've been thinking that one thing is that's comparable in the East and the West as far as teaching, which involves also a sort of intuition about the world, would be um, in Taoism. Um, there's nothing uh, quite equivalent to the Tao in the sense that the way is not at all a matter of following some rules or something along those lines, but it does remind, in some sense, of authenticity as a move from the very rule following um, uh, autonomy in Kant to this authenticity, which is free following the peculiar manner of decision that attaches to a mortal and their personal peculiarity. But moreover, what I was thinking that the Taoism reminds one of is the teaching of daemonism in ancient Greek thinking. Joseph Campbell gives somewhere the example of the episode in Iliad, which is actually it's just very lightly touched upon in Iliad, but the episode of Paris and Prince Paris who carries Helen off to Troy which starts the war, and his so-called judgment of the goddesses, where what he's really choosing is between three fates. And so, for instance, when Jim Morrison died, his father, who was a Navy Academy guy and who had studied Iliad in the original Greek wrote on his real tombstone. I think there's a fake tombstone also at Montmartre that a lot of people go to. On his real tombstone, he wrote that he wrote in Greek that he followed his own daimon. The daimon, the guiding spirit, the genius of the person, or so on, the fate. But it's exemplified in a kind of the mythical thinking, the mythos thinking of the Greeks, in this choice between Hera, who is the goddess of married people and also connects somehow to high status and power, and then is it Athena, and Athena who connects to warrior prowess and to I suppose glory, and then with Aphrodite who connects to Eros or lust. So these are each in the as it were, in the Athenian period, rather than in the early period where this kind of thing was still a teaching. This is turned into a kind of leering Paris who's enjoying the goddesses showing all their showing their bodies to him. But and he's kind of sitting back and leering and just enjoying it, and also part of the power he has. But in the cult versions, in the earlier versions, it's actually that Hermes is has a dagger to him and is forcing him to make this choice, and it's all much more solemn, and because the choice is between three fates it's a heavy choice, and it leads to all kinds of cosmic sort of the microcosm of that choice leads to the macrocosm of the world and the way it plays out. And this is it's a way of thinking which in some way connects to the daimon thinking. So if you have this idea of the daimon, which was this fate principle in the individuals and great individuals and different choices, and links up to the theoi or the gods in some way. This kind of, there's a whole way of thinking that goes along with that. And if then one were to kind of say, but what is the best daimon? Then you get this kind of answer, sort of like Socrates saying, if I saw, I think in the Apology where he says, if I saw a wise man, I would do as he did. In other words, learn simply through empirically, through following him, and therefore gaining the full power of a real phronimos, or somebody who had total practical wisdom. That principle, which is sort of modified through a highly conscious thinking in Plato's Socrates, reminds a bit of the Tao, because to follow the way means it's like it has nothing to do with following the rules or following the laws of your city or anything like that. It's just whatever you do is totally felicitous, right? So there's something like that in the daimon thinking, but it's clearly quite different. But the daimon is also following its path. It's not exactly rational or something like that in the sense of some symmetrical Euclidean rationality. It's probably not predictable at all. So, but these are not thought through trying to let the beings be. They're thought, this mythos kind of talked, perhaps then if we follow Heidegger, we'd have to say it's still a kind of ontic way of thinking, just like the Romans saying omnia Jovis plena, Jupiter in all things. This kind of sense it's not exactly that it's pagan rather than Christian. I don't think that's the difference. The Christian thinking, it moves in about the same way with the God as the first cause and the underpinning, but it doesn't start with the same axis of the way of thinking Dasein. That would be the whole difference. And then, but you can see how those are dynamic. They're about the potential of something, and therefore, when Heidegger wants to go to letting be, he's going to something which is true without being sterile. It's true without standing still. If one were just to make an interpretation of what's coming from being, that interpretation would be a prejudice, as Nietzsche is saying. Nietzsche is saying, well, a big part of Nietzsche's doctrine is saying prejudices are necessary in order to get things going. That's a theme which Strauss deals with in an exemplary way. One of Strauss's favorite themes, I think. Um, but you see, if letting be is truth, then the truth is flowing in these three moments, from the high tide, the middle tide, and the low tide, or depending on how you see it, the reverse. But it is the truth. It's unitary. There's only that truth, which is let be, which the beings show from, which letting be, which means we'll in a way become the beings that are showing themselves from themselves. Um, there's something to it, at least examining it to the mind, and it makes, before thinking about that middle ground, background, and foreground, and thinking it through, it made me think of the verses which will be familiar to students of Freud, of Goethe. I think I know them. All unseen, the threads are knit together, and infinite combination forms.